When Steve moved into the old apartment on the top floor, he didn't expect his life to change so soon. The building was dilapidated but livable. It stood in the heart of the city, and for a young man just starting his career, renting this apartment seemed like a great opportunity. He didn't pay much attention to details like the old wallpaper and slightly peeling paint because the apartment was spacious and inexpensive. However, there was one but. At the very top of the building, directly above his room, there was an attic accessible through a narrow corridor. Steve noticed that the attic door was always shut, and next to it hung a sign that read, "Do not enter. Danger." The first few nights, he didn't notice anything strange. But then, when the dark autumn came, he began to feel that something was wrong. He wasn't easily impressionable, but the sounds coming from the attic woke him up every night. At first, they were quiet, almost imperceptible creaks, as if someone were cautiously moving furniture. Steve tried to ignore them, thinking it was just the old beams of the house, but the sounds grew louder and more distinct with each passing day. At night, sometimes he heard something heavy fall, followed by rustling, as though someone were walking in the attic, searching for something. Several nights passed, and Steve began to lose his peace. He couldn't understand what was happening, and doubts crept into his mind. Why wasn't anyone complaining? What were these sounds? Could someone really be living in the attic? One night, unable to sleep because of the creaks and rustling, he decided to ask his neighbors if they heard these sounds too. He chose Jake, a neighbor down the hall with whom he'd had a few conversations. Jake had been living in the building for a long time, and his experience might be helpful. "Hey Jake, have you ever heard strange noises at night?" Steve asked as he walked into the neighbor's apartment. Jake looked up, and there was something in his eyes that Steve couldn't immediately interpret. He was silent for a few seconds before responding. "You're not the only one." Jake's voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension. "That attic. You know, a couple of months ago, something tragic happened here. A young guy, he was renting this apartment before you. He hanged himself in the attic." Steve was stunned. He knew the building was old, but he hadn't expected such a tragic event. "Are you kidding?" he asked, but there was no hint of a joke in Jake's eyes. "No," Jake paused and added, "they say his spirit appears in the attic every night. Some of us hear his footsteps, like he's wandering up there, like he's still alive. And since then, no one has dared go up to that attic. The door was locked, and honestly, I'd recommend you don't try to get in either." Steve felt his heart beat faster. It was hard to believe, but suddenly all the strange sounds seemed even more ominous. What he had thought was just an old building now took on a different meaning. He thought again about the attic door, which was locked. Why was it so important that no one go in there? What was really hidden behind that warning? The next morning, unable to overcome his curiosity, Steve decided to check it out. He couldn't understand what force was keeping him, but he thought that if these sounds were connected to the incident, he had to see it with his own eyes. He approached the attic door. It was massive and old, like the rest of the house. The metal lock showed signs of rust. Steve took the key that had been left for the tenants and turned it in the lock. The door opened with an unpleasant creak. Immediately on the other side was a dark staircase leading up. Steve listened but heard no sounds except for his own breath and the soft crunch of his steps on the old wood. He climbed up and found himself in the attic. Darkness enveloped him from all sides, but he turned on a flashlight and began to inspect the room. The attic was full of old boxes, unwanted items, and dust that floated in the air. He walked along one of the walls, touching old pieces of furniture that hadn't moved since they had been placed there. But suddenly his gaze stopped at a small corner. There, in the half-darkness, something shimmered. It was a silver bracelet, old-looking and covered in dust. Steve moved closer and noticed that the bracelet was strange. It seemed too personal, as if it had belonged to someone close. As soon as he touched it, a cold ran through his body, and the room immediately became darker, as if a shadow had swallowed the light. Suddenly, there was a sound, as though someone were walking heavily on the wooden boards of the attic. Steve spun around. In the corner stood a figure, unclear and translucent, but he could clearly make out the features of its face. It was the face of a young man, gaunt and pale. He couldn't breathe from fear, but still, his body wouldn't obey him. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the figure. The shadow moved, and with each step, it grew closer. He tried to move away, but his feet seemed to be glued to the floor. The young man approached and extended his hand, slowly reaching it towards Steve. At that moment, all the sounds, footsteps, rustling, blended into one continuous, horrible echo that hung in the air, making his heart race. Steve ran. He ran as fast as he could, and when he reached the stairs, the attic door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang. The next morning, he found the door locked again, as if nothing had happened. But in his mind, everything was clear. He knew that this house held something more than just walls and a roof. That night, he didn't sleep. Steve knew that the one who had once lived there continued to roam the attic, leaving behind an eternal presence. Ethan had just moved into an old apartment on the top floor of a building on the outskirts of town. The building was ancient, with peeling walls and creaky floors. The only pleasant surprise was the affordable rent. He chose this new place mainly because of its seclusion. The windows overlooked a quiet street with almost no cars, and the building itself appeared to be quite abandoned. But as soon as he stepped over the threshold, a strange tension lingered in the air. The neighbors struck him as a little odd at first. They were all elderly people who rarely left their apartments and never spoke to each other. Every time Ethan tried to greet them, he was met only with sideways glances hidden behind half-drawn curtains and quiet conversations that fell silent as soon as he approached their doors. At first, Ethan thought it was simply because he was new, and they were just getting used to his presence, but with each passing day, his unease grew. Sometimes, he thought he heard strange whispers and rustling behind the walls, and one night, he woke up to an inexplicable sound coming from above, a faint, almost inaudible scraping noise, like something was dragging along the hallway. But as soon as he got up and approached the door, everything stopped. However, the strangest thing was that, with the onset of night, the house filled with eerie music. At first, Ethan thought it was some sort of echo from a nearby party, but the sound had no clear source, and the music wasn't like any ordinary melody. It had a strange, low, almost hollow tone. Sometimes, he thought it was coming from above, from the attic. When these nightly sounds persisted for several days, Ethan couldn't take it anymore and decided to find out what was going on. He knew the attic was locked and that no door could be opened without a key, but he didn't let that stop him. He climbed the stairs and noticed that with every step, the air grew heavier and the sounds became clearer. Faint, flickering lights like candle flames guided his way, accompanied by a strange smell, the scent of burning wax candles. When Ethan finally reached the attic and pushed the door open, a cold gust of air hit his face, and the light flickered weakly. Inside, it was so silent that it seemed as if even the air was frozen. But when his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a pentagram on the floor, drawn with some dark substance, possibly blood. In the center of the pentagram was a photograph of Ethan himself, cut from some old document. Around the pentagram stood his neighbors. They were all dressed in long black robes with hoods that obscured their faces. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. He felt a chill run down his spine. The people who had been eyeing him so suspiciously for so long were now surrounding him in the attic. His neighbor from across the hall gave him a faint smile and said something that froze Ethan in his tracks. "You're just in time," she said, her voice calm and slightly drawn out, as though she were speaking in a trance. Ethan took a step back, trying to see the faces of the people in the robes, but all he could make out were empty eyes hidden under hoods. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. "You've become our sacrifice," one of the neighbors said, a sinister smile never leaving his lips. "We've been looking for someone who would be the perfect victim for this ritual. Satan has been waiting for you." You couldn't just walk past, Ethan. It was all predestined. Ethan tried to break free, but his legs wouldn't move. This was unimaginable. He didn't know what to do. His body seemed paralyzed, as though invisible forces were holding him in place. Suddenly, one of the neighbors raised his hand, and a candle appeared behind his back. It lit up, casting light on the pentagram, the edges of which began to sparkle with dark lights, as if a magical force had filled the room. The neighbors began chanting ancient words in an unknown language, and the air around them grew heavier. Ethan desperately tried to break free, but as he stepped toward the door, one of the neighbors stepped forward and touched his shoulder. A cold sensation spread through his body. Like slow-motion scenes in a movie, he felt his consciousness fading into darkness, and the last thing he saw before he succumbed was his neighbors. They stood silently, chanting spells, their eyes gleaming with a kind of madness. When Edward bought the countryside house, he thought it would be the beginning of a new life. After spending several years in the stuffy and noisy city, where work and constant hustle drained all his energy, he decided it was time for a change. The house stood in a quiet, secluded place, surrounded by old trees, and was in perfect condition to move in and start living right away. At first, everything was wonderful. A spacious house, a green garden, silence and peace, everything he had dreamed of. He immediately felt how this rural tranquility filled his soul with serenity. He began to love long walks in the forest, listening to the sounds of nature, and enjoying every moment away from the noise of the city. However, day by day, one detail began to draw his attention more and more: the attic. It was something dark and mysterious, hidden behind a narrow staircase in the far corner of the house. Edward often went up there to inspect the things left behind by the previous owners, but each time something held him back, a strange feeling that he shouldn't be there. The attic door was always slightly ajar, as if inviting him. It was dark inside, and only a few times did he venture there, glancing into the corner before quickly leaving, never fully inspecting everything. The longer he lived in the house, the more he felt that something was wrong. At first, he didn't pay much attention to the strange noises that echoed at night. Whether it was the creaking of the old house or something else, it was unclear. But one day, when he descended from the attic to inspect it in daylight, he was struck by a strange chill coming from the door. With each passing night, the uneasy feeling grew more persistent. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong from the very beginning. One night, when the strange noises kept him awake, he decided to go up to the attic. There was something threatening about what might be hidden there, but his relentless curiosity eventually won out. When Edward opened the door, a dark air hit him with a suffocating smell of dampness and old dust. Inside the attic was an eerie silence, and beyond his view, in the dark corners, the shapes of old things emerged. He noticed a wooden box standing in the corner, covered with a thick layer of dust. But what caught his attention most was a coffin. Yes, a real coffin, standing in the corner, shrouded in half-light. Edward stepped closer. He noticed that the lid was engraved with a name that made his heart skip a few beats. It was his name, Edward.